So just before I hand over the time to Malena, for any technical issues, please contact tech support. So you see tech support labeled as one of the users in the Zoom call. So just message him privately. And of course, we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session for all of you to ask your burning questions to Malena. So that will be at the end of the session, where if you have any questions, please save them. And we will open the floor for questions later on. So do text the user called Q&A. So you see that in the Zoom call as well. So do privately message this user your questions, and we will get to them at the end of the session. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the time to Malena, who will do a bit more of an introduction about herself and kick off the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. And before I get started on any of this, I just want to thank all of you that are my hosts and for reaching out and asking me to do this. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we can spread today at least a glimmer of some new information about separation anxiety for both the pet professionals and the dog owners out there that are wondering, worrying, and confused about the direction with which to go. So that is my goal for today. I have a lot of content to get through. And so forgive me if I'm going to inundate you with a lot of information, but I think it's such a broad and important topic that I couldn't help myself, that I had to include as much information as I possibly could. So today's topic is separation anxiety, as you know, and the title of this presentation is Mission Possible. Many of you know the movies and Mission Impossible, but this is Mission Possible. And one of the reasons that you will learn a little later on, the reason why we call it Mission Possible, is that our daily training exercises that we do with separation anxiety dogs, we call missions. And indeed, the resolution and execution of this behavior protocol is very, very possible. So that's where that beginning title comes from. I appreciate your introduction, and I'm not going to go into introducing myself much further because I think it's actually more important that we talk about all the stuff. But I will, because who doesn't love sharing photos of their dogs? On the left here is my beloved Malena DeMartini, and she came to me with separation anxiety, and I learned quite a bit from her. I've been working exclusively with separation anxiety for over 20 years now, and I had already been practicing for a little over 10 years, I believe, when I adopted Teeny. And of course, she came to me with separation anxiety, unbeknownst to me. So irony of all ironies. And I actually learned a lot from her, not because I wasn't just the trainer, I was the dog mom. And there were a lot of emotions that ran high. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And because it wouldn't be fair to not also introduce my newest girl, Mabel. She is the dog on the right-hand side of the screen. And she has some of her own challenges that we're working through as well. So let's dive right into this. Today's topics, we're going to start with a discussion of prevalence, and we're going to actually define separation anxiety, which may sound sort of silly, like don't we all know what it is? But I think the definition is important. We're going to talk a little bit about the why, and we're going to go into some myths that surround this issue. Then we'll talk about the training itself, and we'll talk about today and what the climate is like today. And we'll wrap up with some success. All right, so let's jump in. We'll start with prevalence. And I've got a number of quotes in this presentation, and I should have mentioned this before I jumped onto this slide. these are all quotes from the research, or the majority of them are, and I don't want you to worry about reading them because I'll be discussing them, but they are in the slides for your purpose and review. And at the end of this presentation, there will be a slide with a bibliography of every citation that was in this presentation. And so you're welcome to screenshot that if you'd like to dive into the research. There is a plethora of it out there. So I wanted to start here and talk about the prevalence in a different light than just the prevalence of the issue. We have so much research surrounding separation anxiety over the past 4 decades, and even further back than that. And these are mostly published studies of experimental research and retrospective research in the fields of applied animal behavior and veterinary behavior. And so when we talk about this issue, we are not talking exclusively anecdotally. We really have a ton of data and a ton of research that reviews what's going on with this particular behavior. So just know you're in good hands, because it's not just Malena telling you what she knows from the last couple of decades. It's also the researchers, the educators, the dog professionals, and veterinarians and veterinary behaviorists. This is actually the #1 most research issue in the past 4 decades, even above aggression, which I find exciting and fascinating, and you may too. But it's probably no surprise, because it is such an issue that needs very explicit and nuanced attention, that people are searching for answers and continue to do so. So let's talk about the prevalence in the general dog population. I am always shocked and amazed about the fact that we have between 22 and 55% of the general dog population are showing some signs of separation-related behavior problems. And they're making up currently 14 to 40% of behavior referral cases. So for those of you that are professionals, this is a really big market, and you probably already realize that. You're probably already getting a lot of emails and phone calls about this issue. For those of you that are dog owners, I hope that seeing these numbers gives you a little bit of a hint of the fact that you are not alone in navigating this issue. There are so many people that are out there that are experiencing this problem with their dog, and there are so many professionals that are able to help you. So please know that you're not alone, that this is quite a welfare issue, and that there's a lot of behavior professionals that are there to help. This is interesting to me. You know, if we talk about that 22 to 55%, that's a big number of the general pet dog population. However, this quote from the study in 2010 said that these problems may be underestimated if the dog is not peeing and pooping in the house, destroying the house, or if nobody hears the dog barking, crying, whining, etc. I will tell you, I always include this slide when I talk about this, because I think there might be an underestimation of the number. But I feel like in the last several years with COVID, we have all learned how to use Zoom, and we all have cameras in our homes. And so many of these dogs that may have been unrepresented in the separation anxiety population are now being discovered. So we'll probably start to see new research coming forth, but I still am not surprised that these issues were underestimated and may still continue to be so, particularly in areas that are not where the dog is not being heard while they're vocalizing, or there's no elimination or destruction. So I want to jump into the definition. And as I mentioned earlier, the definition sounds sort of like, well, gosh, we all know what this is. And we do to an extent, but let's just take a moment to talk about it. There are undesirable behavior problems that occur during owner absence, okay? So we are talking about dogs that are left home alone without anybody present. That doesn't mean they might not have a doggy friend or a cat friend, but they can still present with this problem. So this is problems that occur during owner absence. And the reason why I chose this particular quote is I want to clarify something. I'm going to be talking about separation anxiety today, and I'm going to be using that term liberally. But in the research, we publish this problem under a lot of different expressions and different terms, such as separation-related problems, separation-related behaviors, isolation anxiety, separation reactions, separation-related distress, separation anxiety syndrome. And so I want to tell you that in the research, there's no general consensus as to the way that we use the terminology. I'm using the terminology separation anxiety today because it is the most familiar to all of us, whether you're a dog professional or a dog owner. This is the terminology that we're all familiar with. And I want to just make one small note here that separation anxiety is a bit of an umbrella term that encompasses all of the various issues along the spectrum of dogs that are left home alone during owner absence. And so remember that when we talk about separation anxiety, that terminology doesn't exactly always match the research terminology, but because it's the most familiar to us, I tend to lean into using it for presentations. I want you to think about the term separation anxiety very similar to the way that you would think about if someone said, pass me the Kleenex, you would know they were referring to, hey, pass me the facial tissue, right? It's sort of this big overriding branded name that has become so familiar to us. All right, we're going to go into the why. And when I say the why, there's a big question mark there. And the reason there's a question mark there is that we actually know a lot about what does not cause separation anxiety, and a whole lot less or very little about what does. And so, in this quote from this study, they talked about prevention and etiology remain elusive. And that's what the research has concluded right now. We know a lot about the ways dog presents. We know a lot about the kinds of medications that might be used or alternative remedies, but we don't know a lot about why it occurs. But I want to touch a little bit on that so that we don't leave that as a big question mark and a blank. First of all, there are many behaviors that are correlated with separation anxiety or associated with separation anxiety. But this is an important thing to understand. Correlation does not imply causation, okay? And so just to clarify, what I'm talking about here is that this statement refers to the inability to legitimately deduce a cause and effect relationship, okay, between two variables, right? So there's a correlation, there's another variable, and we can't deduce that solely based on the observed association or correlation between those two variables. So we oftentimes say, oh, the cause is XYZ, But what we're really talking about, particularly in this type of behavior, is the correlated behaviors. And that's important because we just don't know enough about causation as of yet in order to deduce what that is. So I'm going to share this slide, and I won't go into every detail on this, but this is a study that was done actually in 2001. And I chose this study, the chart from this study, because this was the originator of this information. This study has been replicated many times in various ways, which is exciting for me because that's what research should be doing, is showing over and over and over again that we can replicate the research and the studies. And I just want to point out a couple of things here. The first column where it says SA dogs percentage, these are dogs that were known dogs that were suffering with separation anxiety. And the next column says non-SA dogs. These are dogs that do not display with separation anxiety. And I want to point out the first three issues here, behaviors, which are associated with separation anxiety, which are distraction, vocalization, and elimination. And you can see right away that dogs that are suffering from separation anxiety have quite a high percentage of incidence of these behaviors. And dogs that are not have quite a low percentage of incidence of these behaviors. So these are really important behaviors to pay attention to. There are two other things, though, that I want to point out. One is in the next line, shadowing or following the owner closely. Well, I could talk about this in and of itself for an entire hour. I don't have the time, but I want to point out something really important here. It is, as you see, 84% of separation anxiety dogs will shadow or follow their owner closely. However, 64% of non-separation anxiety dogs also shadow or follow their owner closely. And what that really tells us is that this shadowing behavior is not particularly diagnostically significant. And I know that from looking through the research, but I also knew that anecdotally. I have worked with many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dogs at this point in time. But of those that I've worked with, I can't tell you how many of them were what we term as Velcro dogs, right? They shadow or follow very closely. And they start out that way, and we get them entirely through their separation anxiety protocol. They're able to be left alone successfully, but they still shadow. And so I want to make sure that we're separating that out a little bit and understanding that that may have a different function. That behavior may have a very different function. And it is not indicative of, oh, it must be a separation anxiety dog if he follows the owner very closely. I think that's really important. And then lastly, just a nod to the final line in this chart, drooling excessively, vomiting, diarrhea. You see that 20% of separation anxiety dogs will display those symptoms, and 0 non-separation anxiety dogs. So these are extremely important indicators to pay attention to. These are all just associated behaviors. But I want to talk about those things that do not influence separation anxiety. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of information as to what doesn't cause the problem, but we don't have a ton about what does. So every single one of these on this list has been reviewed in the research, even down in the list, celebrating a dog's birthday. Yes, there was a scientist that decided that would be an interesting thing to research, which I find adorable. But many of these are things that we're often being told are causing or even exacerbating our dog's separation anxiety. And like letting a dog sleep in your bed, or failure to obedience train, or talking to your dog like he's a person, or lack of structure, or even improper crate training. And so we know that none of these on this list are actually causing separation anxiety. Now, I want to talk about genetics just for a moment. We have discovered that there's the possibility that a causal factor may be that this is heritable. There may be a genetic predisposition that attributes to having separation anxiety. I think the biggest thing that I want to point out is while we have found some pretty impressive evidence about genetic markers that are associated with separation anxiety, just because that exists does not mean that this is not a modifiable behavior. Okay, there are a lot of things that are influenced by genetics, and this may very well be one of them, based on the research. But does not mean that we cannot help these dogs through proper training, proper protocols, and proper interventions. So I want to jump into some myths. And so we're going to start off here with our unicorn, because these are myths, just like our beautiful unicorn, although we wish our beautiful unicorn was not a myth. And there are so many myths, it would boggle your mind. But based on the interest of time today, I'm only going to go through a handful of them. Some of these may be pretty surprising to you. And some of them I hope will be a bit of a relief, like this very first one. This is, boy, particularly if you are a dog owner, I want you to hear this. And if you take nothing away from today's presentation, I want you to know that you did not cause your dog's separation anxiety. This is a myth that you caused it by letting your dog sleep in the bed, or spoiling them too much, or giving them all sorts of treats and attention. Actually, as the research is starting to indicate, we're finding that the more strong the bond is between the owner and the dog, the more likely that they will be more stable in their alone time behavior. So in the study from McCrave, they talked about spoiling a dog. And spoiling, I think, is in big, scare quotes there. Spoiling can, in my opinion, spoiling means, oh, someone is drawing for us. Thank you. In my opinion, all dogs should be, quote, spoiled. And in other words, they should all have the luxury of having beautiful relationships, love and affection from their owner. So these are just a few examples: allowing the dog to sleep on the bed, taking it on errands, feeding from the table or feeding them treats, etc., allowing on the furniture. None of these correlate with separation anxiety. And so if you have been working with your own separation anxiety dog, or concerned about your dog that has some separation related behavior problems, I just want you to just take a moment and understand this is not your fault. Okay. Now, here we talk about crates, and there's a big, big myth that surrounds crates. And it says you must use a crate for destructive separation anxiety dogs. And we are going to put the big myth stamp on this, because this is absolutely not true. And quite frankly, I mention here for destructive separation anxiety dogs, but for any separation anxiety dog, we do not necessarily need to use a crate. There are some, some exceptions here. Young puppies, we could consider using some sort of confinement. But for destructive dogs, or dogs that are not in their young puppyhood, This would not be an appropriate direction to go. So in this study by Palestrini, they find that cage confinement was increasing the dog's discomfort response, okay? And that was different than the dogs that were allowed to run freely or confined in a room. I want to talk about confined in a room. One of the things that we want to think about when we're talking about confinement is, we're commonly thinking about, I want to keep the dog in a area, in the crate or in a particular space. And I want us to start thinking instead about keeping the dog out of certain areas, like close the bathroom door so the dog can't get in there and rip up the toilet paper. Put a baby gate in front of the kitchen so the dog can't get into the garbage can. Those sorts of things. But let's keep them out of trouble or problematic areas instead of confining them within an area, because this confinement tends to exacerbate the separation anxiety problems. And, unfortunately, we see this, that a lot of people will increase their efforts to confine the dog to prevent that property damage, right? And they'll buy these escape-proof crates or secure the crate with these cords or locks. Unfortunately, this heightens the dog's panic and escalates the intensity of escape behaviors. And I use this quote, as scary as it is, because it says, resulting in self-trauma and in severe cases, death. Confining a dog, whether it's to a crate or a small area, is simply confining the problem of anxiety. It's not addressing the underlying anxiety that exists. And I have good news. If you follow an appropriate protocol to help these dogs, they will not be displaying symptoms of destruction, elimination, or even vocalization. And we'll be talking about that protocol very soon. So here's just an example. This is, and I'll get this off the screen quickly because I know it's not a pleasant picture, but this was destruction in a crate done by a separation anxiety dog. And you can see how this is a very heavily reinforced crate. And even the level of anxiety that the dog was experiencing allowed him to even bend these bars, which we know can result in, broken teeth, broken nails, and all sorts of self-injury, and not make any dent, figuratively, in the separation anxiety behaviors. These are commonly marketed for separation anxiety dogs as escape proof, but I can guarantee you this, that if the underlying anxiety is not addressed, this will only serve as a pretty horrifying place for a dog to exist while panicking. So what can we do instead? We can have dogs, as mentioned, free in areas while we are working on training. And because while we're training, we're not leaving them to the extent that they're going to panic and, create destructive behaviors or eliminate. And the incredible difference in the dog's behavior when being left alone versus being in a crate or in confinement is really significant. So let's talk about food toys. This is probably, between using a crate and using a food toy, these are probably the most commonly given suggestions. And, using a food toy to resolve separation anxiety sounds like a really good idea, but I'm here to tell you that this is actually a myth. Providing a foodstuff toy did not have a significant effect on the incidence of separation-related behaviors, discovered in a study in 2014. And I think one of the reasons that was derived in this study, as well as what I have observed in my practice, is that, well, first of all, many dogs won't even touch the food. They're so anxious, right? So you could leave a ribeye steak in the middle of the living room and they might just not even sniff at it. But for those dogs that would or could eat during alone time, the most common statement that I get is, well, he ate his food stuffed toy and then he started to panic. Okay. And so these food stuffed toys are simply serving as a distraction for maybe a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 at the most, for those dogs that have, let's say, a frozen stuffed toy. And then as soon as that food is gone, the dog ensues in panic. And that's important, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the effect that these food stuffed toys have on separation related behavior problems is rather insignificant. Okay. So while it seems like a great idea to create some sort of association between alone time and food, in actuality, it's quite problematic. So if the owner's absence elicits anxiety, the stimuli that precede the absence will also elicit a degree of anxiety. In other words, I cannot tell you how many clients have contacted me and said, well, my dog was suffering with separation anxiety and I was told to stuff a food toy. So I started stuffing a food toy and he was better for a little bit while I was leaving. But then as soon as the food toy was out, he would start to bark and whine and pace and pant. And then over time, the moment I started to stuff the food toy, the dog would start to pace and pant and whine and bark. That is because we are giving that food toy in advance of a scary absence. And so that food toy is actually predicting something very unsafe. And so in very short order, dogs figure out, oh, well, when she starts to stuff that toy, something bad is going to happen. Okay. And in our training profession, we talk about that as being the wrong order of events, which means we're putting the food in before the scary item instead of putting the food after the scary item. And this is really important. This is really important for us to understand so that we don't make this error. Now, separation anxiety absence rehearsals should be non-contingent. What I mean by this is sometimes you will hear people say, okay, well, step out the door, count to 10, and come back in and give the dog a treat. I will tell you this, it will look as though it is working for a very short amount of time, because the dog will happily say, well, hey, my mom is on the other side of the door. And when she walks in 10 seconds, I get a piece of chicken. Oh, I like this game. But at some point in time, and typically very quickly, that game does not work for that dog anymore. Can you imagine if you're the dog and you're saying, oh, wow, she's gone for 10 seconds and I get a piece of chicken. That's cool. She's gone for 30 seconds and I get a piece of chicken. That's okay. She's gone for 30 minutes and I get a piece of chicken. I can tell you right now, that is not going to work. It's not going to overcome the anxiety that dog is experiencing. They may do it in a very short amount of time, short durations, because it's just a little game that's being played. And they know that someone is right there about to come back in with their treat. But over time, it will become very problematic. I will say that the biggest thing that I find is important about not using food toys in the beginning of any protocol for separation anxiety is that because they can act as a distraction to temporarily distract that dog, it obscures the necessary body language that we have to observe in order to create an efficient protocol. I need to know if when I close my exit door and I'm gone, does my dog panic in 1 second, 10 seconds, 1 minute, 3 minutes? Or does my dog panic as I'm closing the door? I don't even have 1 second. That is information that I need to know in order to create a really efficient and appropriate training protocol. So we don't want to muddy the waters by not being able to see that body language. And I will say also right here, I've been a positive reinforcement trainer since I started in this industry. So I am the first to shout from the mountaintops that, food is one of the most efficient means of training behaviors. But it's very different when we're dealing with an anxiety issue like this, particularly one where we're actually leaving, and the order of events where we would put food down before we leave would be very incorrect. All right, let's talk about training. I'm going to show you a quote, and then I'll give you a highlight of that quote so you don't feel the need to read it, because it's a bit of a long quote, but I think it's really important. So this is from a study done in 2020 by Erica Furbacher and her colleagues. And what they concluded was that systematic desensitization was the critical component for successful treatment. Counter-conditioning, meaning like using food and other behavioral advice, did not influence the behavioral outcome. I think this is really important. And let's talk for a moment about systematic desensitization. What we're talking about is exposing the dog in extremely small increments to alone time. Only those increments that the dog can tolerate successfully will be introduced, and we'll introduce them in a very systematic fashion. We're not choosing those increments based on our own ideas. We're choosing those increments based on what the dog can successfully handle. So this is an important aspect of training. In order to achieve optimal progress during the treatment period, the dog should only be subjected to separations that can tolerate. And this is what we typically talk about as management. And, this is a really important topic that I want to take a few minutes on, even though, my gosh, time is already flying. I've got to catch up a little here, but I want to take a few moments on this. When we train or use behavior modification for any problem behavior, management is essential. If I were to say that I was working with an aggressive dog that did not like children and aggressed towards children, the first thing that I would do is say, we're not putting your dog into a situation where they'll be exposed to children. Now, that may seem obvious because you're thinking, well, there's a liability there. I don't want the dog to bite a child. But that is just simple, straightforward behavior modification. We cannot expose the dog to the scary thing, in this case, alone time, prior to helping to teach them to learn that it is not so scary. And that is where management comes into place. And I understand that this is a hard ask, but remember, this is temporary. I typically tell people that while I would love to be able to say, hey, this will go quickly, it does not. I want people to think in terms of months, not weeks, but also to think in terms of months, not years. Okay. So this is, you've got a dog for 15 or more years of your life. Can we just devote those months to help them overcome this really debilitating issue? And in my opinion, we can. I'm going to share, I know this is blank right now. I'm going to share some data that we collect a lot of data in my company. A lot of people reach out to us on a very regular basis. This data was from 2019. And the reason I chose the 2019 data was it was pre-pandemic. because these numbers changed significantly during the pandemic, and they've gone back to about what they are in this slide since the pandemic has started to decrease in our minds. All right. In 2019, 2,398 prospective clients reached out to us. And that is a big number. Of those clients, 50%, it was actually a little above 50%, but just for purposes of round numbers, 50% were already managing their dog's alone time. In other words, they were not leaving their dog alone for longer than they could handle. Now, that doesn't mean that that had to be them that were staying home with the dog. That could be a friend, a neighbor, a family member. They could go to daycare. They could have a dog walker hang out with them, or a pet sitter. But 50% of these 2,398 people were already managing their dog's alone time, or they were willing to start immediately in order to execute the training. Here's what I think is really important. An additional 35%, once they understood and we talked to them about the importance of managing the dog's alone time, an additional 35% said, oh, now that I understand it, yep, I'm ready and able to do so. So 85% of the 2,398 people that contacted us in 2019 were completely on board with managing their dog's alone time. And I think this is really important to understand, because we often get people saying to us, well, no one would ever commit to not leaving their dog alone for several months outside of training. And I'm here to tell you, our numbers tell us that there is a large percentage that are fine and happy, willing, and able to manage their dog's alone time. I think that this is important. It comes down to creativity. There are many, many ways to manage our dog's alone time. And, many people will first come to mind, well, I guess I have to bring my dog to daycare. Well, guess what? Not all dogs are good candidates for daycare, and not all people can afford daycare every single day of the week, or however often that they need it. So that is but one example of a way that you can manage your dog's alone time. Finding very creative solutions and creating sort of a village of people that can help out with the dog is really important, and it can be done. We have so many creative solutions, and if I had time, I would go through all sorts of ideas with you. But just know that we are only limited by our creativity to think about how to not leave our dogs alone for longer than they can handle for the months of training that we need. Okay, as a little break here, I want to show you a video. This is a dog's before video. In other words, this was his initial assessment. A little trigger warning, the dog is loud. And so if your dog at home gets upset by dogs barking on the television or on the computer, you may want to have treats ready or put your headphones on. There are 3 things that I want you to notice in this video, because we're going to watch an after video in a little bit. The first thing is, the dog's name is Akuma, and I want you to notice Akuma's behavior as his owners are starting to leave. And he's already starting to ramp up in his anxiety behavior. The second I want you to notice is in the middle. What does Akuma's behavior look like when he is actually alone, when they are gone? And the third that I'd like you to notice is, what does Akuma's behavior look like when the parents come back from this very brief absence? Okay, so I will go ahead and play this video, and then we'll move on to some other things, but you'll see a video of Akuma a little bit later where he has made progress.
Just in case he runs out the door. Good idea. We just went worst case scenario and put his ID collar on just in case he ran out the door. Good, thank you. You're going on a walk. Their keys?
That would be huge, huh?
Yeah.
And she used to just step out of his little place.
Okay. So we went both walks out the door with him. Just, I don't even, we'll just see how this goes. Okay. You reading all this? Yep, we're good.
Hey, wait, 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 wait. Hey.
So, yeah. Is that about what you expected?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we can certainly tell that Akuma is pretty distressed about alone time, even as brief as that was. The clients literally walked out the door, got into their car, pulled the car to the driveway, and then pulled back into the driveway a moment later. And that was the display that we saw. So we'll be watching and revisiting Akuma in just a short bit. But let's talk about training. The most important element of this training is that we are teaching safety first, okay? And what I mean by that is that as you saw, let's say in Akuma's video, that dog does not feel safe about alone time. He is terrified. Separation anxiety is a phobia, and by definition, it is very irrational to those that are not experiencing it, but very real to the individual that is, which is in this case is the dog, right? And so by using very, very, very small increments of exposure, we can start to teach Akuma or any dog that, oh, you see, just a couple of seconds of alone time, that's not scary. What about a couple of more seconds of alone time over time? And then a minute, and then a few minutes, and over time it becomes 40 minutes, and then it becomes 2 hours, and so on and so forth, right? So safety is our first goal. And in order to teach safety, we need to keep the dog from experiencing panic. And we're always choosing that criteria that allows the dog to say, oh, yeah, that wasn't scary. That one wasn't scary. And only incrementally and systematically increasing over time. I want to make a nod to something that's discussed commonly, which is pre-departure cues or post-departure cues. In other words, you've exited the door, now you have to close the deadbolt, or you have to, you know, hit the key fob that the dog can hear the car starting. And commonly we're told that in order to do this training, we have to what's called uncouple departure cues. In other words, we have to teach the dog, I'm going to pick up my keys 100 times and it's never going to lead to me leaving you. I'm going to put my shoes on 100 times and it's never going to lead to me leaving you, and so forth. This is very common advice, and unfortunately it is backwards and incorrect. What we need to do is teach that safety first. In other words, the dog says, oh, okay, now I know that 5 seconds of alone time without the keys and without your bag or whatever is safe. And now I know that 30 seconds and 60 seconds is safe. And so now when you introduce, let's say, the keys, that you pick up your keys to exit, the dog probably the very first time will say, uh-oh, this is different. I know this is bad. And we will introduce a very small increment of safe alone time. And because keys used to predict something scary, and now they're going to predict something safe, like that 30 seconds of alone time, we can actually dilute and even remove the saliency of these sorts of pre-departure cues. This is a webinar all on its own. This discussion could go on for hours, but I wanted to just make a nod to the importance of this. So let me talk about what is a mission. A mission is basically our individualized criteria steps that we do 5 days a week, okay? And these are approximately 30-minute sessions or less, 20 to 30-minute sessions. In that 20 to 30 minutes, there are a number of warm-ups for the dog, and those warm-ups are very easy, or maybe the occasional medium in difficulty, okay? And think about warm-ups as stretching before you go for a run or before you go for exercise. So imagine if you were going to run 10 miles. I would not say, hey, in order to run 10 miles, I'd like you to warm up by first running 3 miles, then running 5 miles, and then running 8 miles so that you are ready for your 10-mile run. I would say, let's stretch, let's walk around a little bit, let's get the body warmed up, and then you'll go for your 10-mile run. And that's what warm-ups should look like in a mission. We also want to be variable with our duration and our pre-departure cues that we just talked about. So we will not ever go in a straight line. Like today, our hardest step was 10 seconds, and tomorrow it's 30, and the next day it's 1 minute, and the next day it's 2 minutes. That is absolutely not the direction we want to go. We actually need to vary it up so that some days are nice and easy, and some days are slightly on the challenging side without ever pushing the dog past the point that he will start to panic. Remember, safety first. We have to take pauses in between our steps in a mission. Typically those pauses are, a minute to 3 minutes, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depending on what the dog needs. And we are only going to do these missions about 5 days a week. So at least 1 to 2 days off per week. And that's very important for the dog's learning. And for you as the dog owner, you need a break as well. On this next slide, I'm going to show you an example of a mission. And I want you to not get bogged down in the steps that are written. I just want to show you the structure that the mission is dependent upon, okay? So you'll see that in this example mission, there's a number of steps, and all steps in the mission are considered warm-ups except for the final step. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. All steps in a mission are considered warm-ups, right? Those stretches before the run, except the very final step. The final step in the mission is the most challenging. It should not be challenging every day. It should vary and sometimes be easy or very easy or medium level, and sometimes just brush the underbelly of that dog's ability, but very rarely. So there's only one step in the mission, this final step, that creates a bit of a challenge for the dog. This is probably one of the most important pieces of our discussion today. The dog sets the pace. I want to set the pace as your trainer. You want to set the pace as the dog owner. But guess what? We cannot. The dog sets the pace. So every single day that we're conducting a mission, we're asking a question to the dog. How does this feel for you today? Would you rate that really well today? Dog, my friend, my dog. Yeah, you would? Okay, great. Then tomorrow we'll adjust our criteria according to how you feel about today. It's never you nor I that set the pace. It's always the dog that is making that decision. Okay, well, I know you wanted to see Akuma's second half of the video. This is a video that is only 27 days later. And in that 27 days, the client had conducted 20 missions, so 20 training sessions. The reason I choose this is that I want you to understand that this process is about progress, not perfection. This video does not show a dog that is ready to be left alone for hours and hours and hours and hours. Not yet. Although, spoiler alert, Akuma successfully did graduate. But this is just to show you that in just about a month, tremendous progress can be made. And we build upon that progress bit by bit by bit. So remember the three things that I asked you to take notice of in the beginning. How Akuma reacted when the owner was leaving, how Akuma reacted when he was alone, and how Akuma reacted when someone returned. I want you to notice all three of those in this video. This video happens to be just mom leaving, but Akuma's behavior was identical, whether it was mom, whether it was dad, whether it was both of them. This just happens to be the 27-day reassessment that we did. And the last thing I want to point out is the only training that Akuma received was gradual exposure to alone time. Oftentimes people say, oh, did you teach him to walk away? Or did you teach him to exhibit these behaviors? No, we did not. Not at all. We basically trained Akuma to learn that when we leave, it's not scary. And that started out with a millisecond and built upon that to this point that is 27 days later and 20 training sessions later. So let's take a look. Okay, so again, I want to point out that is progress, not perfection, but what a tremendous difference in the dog's behavior. And you could see how we could very, very readily build upon that calm behavior when alone. Now, I know we're just hitting the hour right now, so I've still got a couple more slides, so bear with me as we kind of get into wrapping up the rest of this presentation, and then we'll jump into your Q&A. If you have some questions. So part of behavioral behavior modification is potentially using behavior medication. And this can play a role in treatment for separation anxiety, can decrease anxiety and arousal so that that behavior modification can be implemented more successfully. Now, this is referring specifically to medication, meaning pharmacological interventions. However, we can certainly discuss the role of other remedies, holistic organic remedies as well, as I think that might be a question, as I was alluded to earlier. I want to say today, right? If you're a dog professional or a dog owner, I want you to think about this. Every dog is an individual with differing presentations of their separation anxiety. Every environment is different, right? And those needs and abilities of the owner are also very different. So customized care for these dogs from specialists or from you as the owner that does your due diligence and research, and hopefully works with your trainer and your veterinarian, or at least does some research so that you can implement these protocols on your own. That is absolutely, unequivocally required in order to achieve optimal results with alone time. Okay, every dog is an individual. So let's just wrap up here with some success quotes and some thoughts on that. I've got a few quotes here, and each are a little bit different, and I wanted to point them out before we wrapped up today. This first one, although treatment was eventually successful for all dogs in this study, there was a considerable individual variation in both rapidity and variability of progress, right? And what I want to point out about this was, yay, successful for all the dogs. However, some dogs moved through the protocol more quickly. Some moved through the protocol more slowly. And there was variation along the way, meaning some, did great for a little while and then plateaued or even regressed a little bit. Some went really slow for a bit and then catapulted very quickly. So we have to remember that individuality is so important, and to not be frustrated by our dog's behavior that is slowly evolving into success. I love this quote. It's so simple, right? But this is from someone that I found to be very inspirational, Victoria Voith, who I was very proudly able to meet years ago. Had this quote, if diagnosed and treated correctly, the prognosis for a dog with separation anxiety is excellent. And I think that one of the reasons I choose this quote is that this was in 1985 that they started to understand this, right? And I just find that amazing, because so much research has been conducted since that point. And already back in the 1980s, were they realizing that the prognosis was so tremendous. And then lastly, owners should be encouraged that it is never too late, or a case is never too bad to contemplate treatment, because these factors do not seem to affect prognosis. So if you are a dog owner and you've been frustrated and working with your dog, or having your dog bark and whine and howl for months now, or even years now, or you're worried that the behavior is so bad that you just don't even know that you could start, neither is the case too bad, nor is it too late. Okay, those do not affect prognosis. And I think that that's really terrific news. All right. Well, I told you we would have a bibliography, so here it is. These are all the quotes, the citations from the quotes that were used in this presentation. Feel free to take a screenshot. This is probably 1/10 of the studies, not even 1/10, 1/100th of the studies that are out there on separation anxiety. But I think it's very interesting research if you're interested in diving into the research. And I think we're ready to wrap up, and I didn't go too badly over time. I think we're ready to wrap up and start with questions. Would you like that I stop sharing? Is that the best way to go about it?
I think you can leave the screen on, that's fine.
Okay.
Have a bit of but thank you, Malena, for your fantastic sharing. I think I really like the part where you mentioned that separation anxiety is like a phobia, like a panic disorder. So it is a potential welfare problem, which, if your dog has separation anxiety, it would be really good for the dog's welfare if you could do something about it. So I think we also learned a lot about some of the myths that a lot of us have heard of or have been recommended to do when faced with a separation anxiety dog. So like giving food toys, which I think is quite surprising to many, that food toys don't really work and could actually be detrimental to the dog. And with that, I think we will start going into the questions. So there are quite a lot of questions coming in. So I do apologize if we don't get to your questions. So just a caveat. We're supposed to end at 10:30 after 20 minutes of Q&A. So Malena, you mentioned just now that there was a impending question. So that question's from me, so I'm just gonna ask it right now. Because you mentioned behavior modification drugs, so like those really serious drugs that could be used to reduce stress and reduce anxiety and make your protocol more efficient. So those are like the serious drugs, like the antidepressants and other like SSRIs and things like that. My question is, in your experience, do you think using homeopathic remedies or natural solutions like calming supplements. Do those work in your experience, and do many owners actually benefit from using some of these natural supplements?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked this question. I think it's an important question to address. And before I answer it, I want to be very clear that I have my own anecdotal experience and my own bias based on my experience. And I want to say also, and forgive me, I'm not trying to correct your statement, but when you say these are serious drugs, I want you to know that they are very, very heavily researched and very safe to use with the proper medical supervision. And so I think we, as of late, maybe in the last 20 years, we have made a bit of a divide between pharmacology versus holistic remedies, et cetera. And I just want to also remind people that pharmacology is driven from, the research that allows us to use a lot of the remedies that sometimes we're using holistically, but we're able to distill them in such a way that they're able to be used as actual medications. Having said that, I think it's really interesting that there is such there can be such a divergence in our comfort about using a pharmacological intervention versus a holistic or alternative remedy. And I think more so today, are we leaning towards, organics and holistics and alternatives, et cetera. I want to say the thing that I find really important about that is we don't have, in the US, and maybe this is different where you are, we don't have any regulation for insofar as the research and testing that goes behind a lot of these holistic remedies. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of research that shows the ingredients, the level of potency, and the variation from brand to brand and bottle to bottle is quite significant and not consistent. And just because something is holistic or organic or natural doesn't mean that it is not contraindicated with other medications or other remedies. And so I want to caution everybody, if you are going to administer anything that your dog is going to ingest, even if it's just something that you think is just a holistic or natural remedy, that should be a discussion that you have with your veterinarian. There are some very common natural remedies that actually are extremely dangerous if combined with things like heartworm medication. And you might not know that unless you discuss that with your vet. Lastly, I want to say, anecdotally, for me, I have not seen the type of impact that is appropriate for helping with separation anxiety from the majority of the alternative remedies. But conversely, I want to just mention that with medication, the goal of using a medication is to enhance learning and enhance retention. We're not wanting to make a dog sleepy, dopey, lethargic, groggy. We don't want to change their personality. And if that is the case, that is the wrong medication for that dog. Medication is not for everyone or for every dog for that matter. But I want people to be careful to not think of it as a last resort. You know, I understand sometimes that people might even think that there's a cost issue with the pharmacological approach, but actually, boy, are many of the natural remedies extremely expensive, particularly if you're like, well, I need this one for that and this one for the other thing. There's one natural remedy that is very common here in the US. I won't mention the brand because I don't want to, you know, dish them, but it is a very common one, and it is more expensive than using a typical antidepressant type of medication, and unfortunately most often less effective. So that's my personal bias, and that is what I have experienced.
Thank you, Malena. Hope you all don't mind that I stole the first question.
I
but
love that you did. Thank you.
clarifies things. I think we will move on to the next question now. And we have one that came in pretty early. So this question is, my dog starts to bark, whine, and pace when we leave the house with our other dog, but does not vocalize and pace when we leave the house without our other dog. Is this separation anxiety, and what would be your advice?
So I just want to be clear. So when the other dog is left home together, when the two dogs are home together, it's okay. But when they remove when they take let's say a walk with the second dog, there's a problem. So I have good news and bad news, I guess. The good news is you have management in place right now, because what you are able to do is when your dog is left with your second dog, with the other dog, everything seems okay and everything is fine. So you can very gradually and incrementally start to introduce your dog to time without his or her buddy. And this is a little bit of a different protocol than what we talked about today, because this is typically for dogs, just alone time dogs. But you can start to do things like, I'm going to leash the second dog up, and then I'm going to undo the leash and start and go back, and then we're done. Or things like that. So starting to introduce the second dog's absence. It's a little bit more nuanced than anything that I want to take a ton of time on today, but I want to assure you that you can work on this, and that I want to just remind you of the very positive point that you've got a dog that is okay staying with your other dog. And so you've got management in place, and that is really important.
Right. Thank you for answering that question. And I think there's another question that came in, which is on a similar sort of vein. And this question is about whether or not getting another dog or another pet would help with separation anxiety.
I'm so glad this question was asked, because as you saw, I was just squeezing in as much information as I could into the hour, and I even went over almost 10 minutes. But that is one of the most prevailing myths that is out there, and a very common recommendation. Well, your dog is just lonely, get another dog. Well, unfortunately, and even the research shows only about 11% of dogs with separation anxiety are helped by the presence of another animal. That's a pretty low percentage. So one of the things that I am worried about is, what if we bring a second dog into the home to help, quote unquote, fix the first dog, and that doesn't help. Now we have two mouths to feed, 2 dogs to walk, 2 dogs to, pick up poop for, and all the things, but we still have the same problem. I will say that it is not very common that separation anxiety is considered like a contagion issue, but it also can happen that you bring in a second dog and the first dog is displaying anxiety when left alone, and the second dog starts to pick up on that anxiety, and now you have 2 dogs with separation anxiety. So I very commonly tell people, if you really are wanting a second dog in your family, don't let me stop you. But if you're considering a second dog to help your separation anxiety dog, take a moment, pause, reconsider, and realize that training is going to be essential regardless.
I think that's very helpful. Yes, exactly. If you have 2 dogs with the same problem, then it's double the work, I suppose. So
Yeah.
I think that's not a good thing to have. So maybe we'll move on to the next question. This question is about lots of people's dogs having separation anxiety questions that they would like to ask you. So it says, my adopted dog is potty trained at home and she hits the mark almost 95% of the time. However, when we go out of the house, she pees in the hall and plays around with the pee, using her face to spread it around. Do you think that this is separation anxiety, and what can we do? So this dog, he also adds that she used to be an ex-breeding dog for almost 6 years. So like an ex-puppy mill breeder dog.
Sure. Okay. The first thing I have to say is, as much as I would love to give you a definitive answer, I'm not a veterinarian and I cannot diagnose separation anxiety, nor could I diagnose it from, even if I could, from just knowing that those few bits of information. I think there's a couple things to consider here. The most important is getting video of your dog when left alone. And now we have things like Zoom that are really easy to set up, and you can record your dog for a little while you're gone. And you can see the behavior. And because if your dog is just, for instance, just suddenly pees and then goes off and takes a nap, that's very different than if your dog is exhibiting behaviors that are indicative of anxiety. And you will be able to see that in the video. And if you're not sure, then you should definitely consult a professional, a veterinarian, a dog professional trainer, behavior consultant, because I think it is important to determine what the function of that behavior is. And it very well could be anxiety. And if it is, then I would really start to follow a process of systematic desensitization and teaching the dog that in very small increments that alone time is not scary.
All right. Okay, thank you. So we have another question about the signs of progress, about measuring the signs of progress. So the person asked so you mentioned calmness on pre and post departure cues, as well as a zero greeting when they return. So are there any other signs of progress that people can look out for to show that, their dog is getting better?
Oh gosh, so many. Excuse my voice. So many. There are one of the things that I love about this work, to be honest with you, is that we can celebrate the very smallest wins. And we can find those in the dog's body language and behavior. So imagine if you had a dog that always whined or always drooled, or as the last person said, always peed and then rolled around in the pee, or used their nose to spread the pee around. And you did an absence and they didn't pee, or they didn't whine, or they didn't pace or drool or pant for that first 5 seconds or whatever that may be. That is progress. In that second Akuma video, that was the first time Akuma had sat, as you probably saw in the video. That was the first time that Akuma had sat during an absence. Just the change in behavior in a position, like, oh, you know what, I think I'll sit today, or I think I'll lie down, even if it's just for a few moments. That is progress. And we have to really take those tiny bits of body language and behavior and celebrate those wins and capitalize upon them by realizing, okay, what we did today was successful. So now we need to figure out what our next successful steps and criteria are. I think there's and it's hard to pinpoint because every dog's body language and behavior is so different, but you will start to see differences in behavior, and sometimes even differences in behavior outside of alone time. For instance, when you go to the coat closet to take something out, if your dog usually would run to the closet like, oh gosh, oh gosh, oh gosh, she's probably going to leave, and you open the coat closet and the dog goes, whatever, that is a huge success, and that is worth celebrating.
Right, thank you. So it's like if they also maybe have generally less stress, then you might also see that in other behaviors potentially.
It's possible, and it's common. I want to make sure that people don't misunderstand that, fixing this problem is going to fix every behavior problem. But one of the things that's really interesting about separation anxiety, and really any fear-induced or anxious type of behavior, when we start to lower the dog's anxiety, let's just say in this area, in separation anxiety, and if the dog has multiple problems, like the dog is anxious about alone time, the dog is anxious about meeting strangers, the dog is anxious about sounds, let's say noises. When we start to lower one type of anxiety, we commonly, not always, but we commonly see that bleeds over into being beneficial for some of the other anxieties in that dog's life, because we're not stacking all of these anxieties on top of each other anymore. So yes, even improvements in other aspects of the dog's life. I mean, I remember when I first worked with Teeny, my Teeny DeMartini dog, the first time that I went in and used the bathroom and she didn't follow me in or cry at the door, I was celebrating, right? And that wasn't even leaving the house, but I thought, oh my gosh, the training is impacting her behavior.
That's really nice. Small wins can go a long way.
win.
Okay, so we are almost time, but I'm going to ask two more questions.
Yes, of course.
One more that you would probably like to enjoy answering is, does providing your dog or cat with a piece of your clothing with your scent on it help them to become calmer?
So this was another myth that I didn't have time to put in today. And I want to fold in another myth about this too. I love this question because it's so endearing, right? Like, okay, I'll just sleep in my shirt tonight and leave it for my dog, and that will help calm her or him. And what a beautiful thought. But I want you to remember what dogs or cats, for that matter, and their ability to a sensation of smell. They're, particularly dogs, I wish I could remember the number, but their parts per million that they can detect in scent is, beyond anything that we could remotely imagine as human beings. Your whole house smells like you. And so leaving, your shirt that you've just worn with your dog, it will probably make little, if any, difference whatsoever. I don't want to minimize the fact that scent is very important for dogs. And I think that we can use scent in a variety of ways, but that is typically not one of them. And the other common myth is that we would leave, let's say, a television or a radio on, and that would calm the dog. And unfortunately, while there are benefits to masking outdoor noises, particularly in a high density apartment building, right? If you've got people coming in and out of their apartments a lot, and you can mask that noise a little bit if the dog reacts to that. Calming music, unfortunately, is a bit of a myth as to being able to relieve or even ameliorate separation anxiety.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying yet another myth. So many of them to go through, but
No.
it's a shame we don't have the time. And I think we're going to end off with one last question about cats. So someone asked if you can use the same techniques to apply to cats with separation anxiety as well.
I love that this question is asked, and it's so pertinent right now because I exclusively work with dogs. I have been contacted by many cat owners. I have been contacted by many horse owners. I have even been contacted by some people that had penguins in a zoo area that had separation anxiety. And while the learning principles for all species are similar and really, quite frankly, the same, their anxiety displays are different, and their biological needs are potentially different as well. And the reason I say this is kind of a poignant question right now is that one of my graduates from my program, which we call CSATs, Certified Separation Anxiety Trainers, is a cat specialist, and she is embarking on some research as to whether this protocol will apply across the board for cats or whether it needs to be modified. So I guess my best answer is stay tuned. There's some research coming forward just for you and your cat.
That sounds really exciting. So can't wait for that piece of research to come out. So I think we will end the session for today because it's just over 3 minutes now. Thank you so much, Malena, for spending your Friday evening with us. I know it's a Friday evening as well, so you should be out partying, but instead you're with us talking about separation.
This is my kind of partying, is hanging out with all of you. So I really just want to say thank you. I appreciate you hosting me. I appreciate everybody in the audience, and I really appreciate all these great questions. And if ever there were an opportunity or a need to have me come and just do Q&A or anything like that, it sounds like there's a lot of people that have needs and questions. So I'm happy to come back.
Thank you so much. So just for everyone else, before we say goodbye, this session is recorded and it will be posted on the MParks YouTube page for viewing for the next 6 months. So it'll be taken down after 6 months. But if you have any friends or family who would like to watch it and didn't have the time today, please share with them that it will be on the MParks YouTube page. So thank you so much. And then I think with that, we will say goodbye. And I hope that everyone has a lovely weekend. And yeah, all the best.
All the best. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.